The chamber doors sealed shut behind me, with a sound like a held breath being released, and I knew there was no walking out until this was over. My name is Elena Marsh, and I was standing in the gallery of the Galactic Council chamber when they voted to sell my entire species. The vote had already started. I had missed the opening statements, the polite introductions, the ceremonial nonsense that these ancient beings love to drown their decisions in. All I caught was the tail end of it, the final words from a counselor named Rethe Solon, a tall being with silver skin and eyes like still water, saying that humanity, quote, presents an efficient opportunity for reallocation. Reallocation. That was the word they used. Not conquest, not war, just paperwork. I gripped the railing in front of me so hard my knuckles turned white. Around me, other delegations watched with the same bored curiosity you might give a weather report. Nobody in that chamber looked at humanity as people. We were a line item, a resource nobody had claimed yet, floating unclaimed in a corner of the galaxy, and under council law, unclaimed meant available. I had read the law myself, 3 days earlier, in a records room nobody else bothered to visit anymore. Article 12 of the Founding Compact stated that any sentient species, without a registered patron, without a defense treaty, and without formal recognition before the Council, could be classified as an open asset. Open assets could be assigned, sold, traded, leased, however the winning bidder wanted to phrase it. Humanity had never registered. Humanity had never asked for a patron. We had simply been discovered, catalogued, and left alone for 100 years while older species argued about what to do with us. And now, apparently, the argument was over. The council chamber was shaped like a great open bowl, with row after row of seats rising up around a central platform where the current speaker stood. The ceiling stretched so high above that it disappeared into a soft blue haze, meant to represent the open sky no species could agree on. Delegates from over 40 worlds sat in their designated sections, some tall, some small, some built from shapes I had no words for, all of them here to decide what price my species was worth. I was not supposed to be in the gallery today. I was a junior archivist attached to the small, mostly ignored human delegation, the kind of role nobody expected to matter. My job was supposed to be filing reports and organizing translated documents in a back office 3 floors below this chamber. But when I heard whispers that today was the day, I used my access badge and walked straight up, past 2 guards who barely looked at me, because who would think a young human woman with a data tablet under her arm was worth stopping? Rethe Solon continued speaking, her voice smooth and unhurried, as if she were reading out a shopping list. The species designated Homo sapiens occupies a single home system with limited expansion, she said. Their technology, while adequate for local survival, poses no threat to established interests. Their historical patterns show no unified defense structure, no patron alliance, and no formal registration despite 117 standard years of contact. I move that the Council proceed to open bidding for reallocation rights. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Not shock, just mild interest, the way you might react to news that a new restaurant had opened nearby. I felt sick. My stomach twisted so hard I had to grip the railing again just to stay standing. Behind me, someone shifted in their seat, and I turned to see Daniel Cross, one of the human liaison officers, his face pale, his jaw locked tight. He was the closest thing humanity had to an actual voice in that chamber, and even he looked like he was watching a car crash happen in slow motion, powerless to stop it. "They can't do this," I whispered to him. "They can," he said quietly, not looking at me. "There's no law against it. That's the whole problem. We never signed anything. We never registered. We just showed up on their radar one day, and they decided to wait and see what we'd become." "And now they've decided," I said. He nodded and said nothing else. The council speaker, an old and imposing figure named Chancellor Vorn Kaith, rose from the central seat. His species had been part of the council since its founding, thousands of years ago, and it showed in the way he carried himself, like a man who had never once in his long life been told no. "The motion has been raised," Vorn Kaith said, his voice deep and slow, carrying easily to every corner of the chamber without any need for amplification. "Are there any objections before we proceed to formal vote?" Silence. I looked around at the different delegations, hoping someone, anyone, would stand up and say this was wrong. But species after species simply sat there, arms folded, faces unreadable, waiting for the vote to move forward so they could get back to whatever business actually mattered to them. Nobody objected, nobody even blinked. "Very well," Vorn Kaith said. "We proceed." The voting screens lit up above each delegation's seat, a soft glow of either green or red depending on their choice. One by one, the lights began to change. Green after green after green. Not a single red light appeared anywhere in that enormous chamber. I watched my species get voted away like a piece of unused land, and there was nothing I could do but stand there and watch it happen. The final tally appeared above the central platform in massive glowing numbers. 211 votes in favor, 0 opposed, 3 abstentions, likely species who simply did not care either way. "The motion passes," Vorn Kaith announced, and something about the calm, procedural way he said it made it worse than if he had shouted it. Reallocation rights for the species Homo sapiens and their associated home system will proceed to formal auction, pending final confirmation. Pending final confirmation. Those 3 words were the only thing standing between my species and becoming property. I turned to Daniel, my voice shaking now despite everything I tried to do to keep it steady. "What does that mean? Pending confirmation?" He swallowed hard before answering. "It means there's a formality left. Before any vote like this becomes permanent, the affected species is given one chance to speak. A final word. It's ceremonial. Nobody expects it to change anything. It never has, not once in council history. Then why does it exist? Tradition," he said bitterly. "The old species like to pretend they're fair. They let you speak so they can say they gave you the chance, right before they do exactly what they were always going to do anyway." I looked back down at the chamber floor, at Vorn Kaith settling back into his seat, at the delegates already shifting in their chairs, ready to move on to whatever agenda item came next, as if they had not just voted to erase the independence of an entire species. "Who gives the final word?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "Whoever is designated as the ranking human representative present in the chamber." I felt my heart stop for half a second. "Where is the ambassador?" I asked. "Delayed," Daniel said, and the word came out like a curse. "His transport had a mechanical fault 3 systems away. He isn't due to arrive for another 6 hours. By then, the confirmation vote will already have started." "Then who speaks for us?" Daniel looked at me, and something in his expression shifted, a mixture of dread and desperate hope, like a man reaching for anything solid in the middle of a storm. "Technically," he said slowly, "the ranking representative is whoever holds the highest security clearance in this room right now. And Elena, I checked the room roster 20 minutes ago." My mouth went dry. "It's you," he said. "Your clearance from the archive division outranks mine. You're the one who gets the final word." I stared at him, certain I had misheard, certain there was some mistake, some clerical error that would be fixed the moment anyone actually looked closely at it. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I saw one of the chamber officials, a small floating drone with a glowing blue eye, drifting toward our section, scanning the gallery, searching for exactly the kind of confirmation Daniel had just given me. The drone stopped in front of me and spoke in a flat, artificial voice. "Confirmed. Elena Marsh, Archive Division, Human Delegation. You have been recognized as ranking representative present for the affected species. You are granted the ceremonial right of final address before the council votes to ratify reallocation. You have 3 standard minutes to prepare. Please proceed to the central platform when called." The chamber around me seemed to grow larger and colder all at once. 200 delegates, ancient and powerful, were about to listen to whatever I had to say, and then vote anyway, exactly as Daniel had warned. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat against the railing just to steady myself. But underneath the fear, something else was rising in me too. Something sharper, something that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind for the last 3 years, ever since I had first been given access to the deep archive files nobody else in the entire human delegation had bothered to read. Files that were not supposed to matter. Files that had been buried under layers of outdated formatting and forgotten storage systems. Files I had only opened out of boredom on a slow afternoon. Files that had kept me awake at night ever since, wondering if what I had found was even real, wondering if I was the only person alive who understood what it actually meant. I had never told anyone, not my supervisors, not the ambassador, not even Daniel standing right beside me now. I had planned to bring it forward through official channels eventually, carefully, with proper verification, at some safer and more diplomatic moment. There was no safer moment now. There was only this one. Daniel touched my arm, his voice barely a whisper. "Elena, whatever you're going to say it carefully. This isn't a place for emotion. These beings only respect facts and leverage. If you go up there and beg, you'll only confirm every assumption they already have about us." I turned to look at him, and for the first time since the vote had been announced, I felt something steady settle inside my chest. "I'm not going to beg," I said. The drone's blue eye pulsed once. "Elena Marsh, the council is ready. Please proceed to the central platform." I stepped away from the railing, smoothed down the front of my jacket with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and walked toward the stairs leading down into the bowl of the chamber, toward 211 ancient beings who had just voted to erase my species from the map of free civilizations. They thought this was a formality. They had no idea what they had just given me permission to say. The walk down to the central platform felt longer than it should have. Every step echoed against the polished floor, and every eye in that vast chamber turned to follow me, curious, dismissive, some openly amused at the sight of a single young human descending alone toward the place where empires had once stood. I reached the platform and stopped at its center, a small circle of pale light meant to focus every voice that stood there. Above me, the glowing tally still hung in the air, 211 in favor, 0 opposed, a number that would soon become permanent unless I found the right words in the next few minutes. Chancellor Vorn Kaith looked down at me from his seat with the patient expression of someone who had sat through 1,000 final addresses before mine and expected this one to be no different. "You have been granted the right of final word," he said. "Speak, representative of Homo sapiens. The council will listen, though the outcome of this vote is not expected to change." A few soft sounds rippled through the chamber, something between laughter and boredom, the kind of reaction you give when you already know how a story ends. I lifted my chin and let my eyes move slowly across the rows of delegates surrounding me, giving myself one last second to breathe before I spoke. "My name is Elena Marsh," I said, and to my own surprise, my voice came out steady, clear, carrying easily across the open space. "I am an archivist for the human delegation. I did not expect to be standing here today, and I suspect none of you expected it either." Vorn Kaith's expression did not change. "The council granted this address as tradition. Please proceed with your statement." "I intend to," I said. "But before I do, I want to make sure everyone here understands exactly what tradition means and exactly what confirmation would mean if this vote goes forward as planned." A counselor near the front row, a broad, armored being named Groth Ilsa, let out a low sound that might have been a laugh. "The tradition means nothing changes. Say your piece, human, and let us proceed." I turned toward him, and something in my expression must have carried more weight than I expected, because his laugh faded halfway through. "You are right that tradition rarely changes anything," I said, "because most species who stand on this platform come here with nothing but a plea. They ask for mercy, they ask for delay, they ask for pity from beings who have never once needed to feel any. I understand why the vote never changes after that. Pity is not leverage." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "I am not here to ask for mercy. I said. "I am here to ask this council a question, and I want an honest answer before this vote becomes permanent. How old is the oldest surviving record in this chamber's archive?" The chamber went quiet in a different way now, confusion replacing amusement. Vorn Kaith tilted his head slightly. "That is an unusual question for a final address." "Humor me," I said. "It matters more than you think." A records official near the base of the platform, a small quiet being with a translucent body, checked a data console and answered in a flat, formal tone. "The oldest verified record within council archives dates to approximately 11,000 standard years, associated with the founding charter of the council itself." 11,000 years, I repeated. "And in that time, how many species have joined this council as founding members, versus how many have joined afterward as, in your words, discovered species?" The official checked again. 7 founding members. All others, including humanity, are classified as discovered species, having joined after initial council establishment. 7 founding members, I said, letting the number hang in the air. Ancient, powerful, respected. Species whose history stretches back further than almost anyone in this chamber can properly document. Species whose technology, whose governance, whose entire civilization is considered the foundation upon which everyone else built." End quote. I turned in a slow circle, meeting the eyes of as many delegates as I could. "I would like to ask the founding species a simple question," I said. "Would any of you like to tell this chamber, in your own words, how your civilizations first learned to build a stable jump corridor, how your first unified governments were formed, how your first shared communication protocol, the one every species in this room still uses today, came into existence?" Silence. Reith Solun, the counselor who had first raised the motion against us, spoke up with a note of impatience in her voice. "This is a delay tactic. The human representative is stalling to avoid the inevitable." "I promise you," I said, "I am not stalling. I am asking because I already know the answer, and I do not think most of you do." That got their attention. A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber, delegates leaning toward each other, whispering in a dozen different languages the translation devices struggled to keep pace with. 3 years ago, I said, I was given clearance to a section of the archive division that almost no one bothers to visit anymore. Old records, poorly maintained, considered outdated and irrelevant by almost every species who has access to them. I was bored one afternoon, and I started reading files that had not been opened in centuries. I let that sink in before continuing. What I found changed everything I understood about this council, about the founding species, and about my own species' place in this galaxy. And I think it is only fair, before this council votes to make humanity's reallocation permanent, that everyone here understands exactly what they are voting to erase. Vorn Kaith's expression finally shifted, the calm patience replaced by something more careful. "Representative Marsh, if you are suggesting some form of fabricated evidence to delay this vote, I would caution you against wasting the council's time." "I am not fabricating anything," I said. "Every record I am about to reference exists within your own archive, verifiable by your own officials, in real time, right now, in front of everyone in this chamber." I turned to the records official standing near the base of the platform. "I would like to request access to Archive Section Designation Delta 7, Founding Era, subsection marked Restricted, Historical." The official hesitated, glancing up toward Vorn Kaith for approval. The Chancellor's eyes narrowed slightly, but after a long pause, he gave a small nod. "Grant access," Vorn Kaith said. "Let us see what the human representative believes she has found." The official's fingers moved across the console, and a moment later, a large glowing display rose up above the central platform, visible to every delegate in the chamber. Rows of file designations appeared, ancient and dust-covered in their digital formatting, clearly untouched for a very long time. "Display the file marked Corridor 0, I said. The official complied, and an old document appeared on the screen, faded and difficult to read, written in a script that predated the modern council language by thousands of years. "This," I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was pounding, "is the original design specification for the very first stable jump corridor ever constructed in this galaxy. The corridor that made travel between founding worlds possible in the first place. The corridor your civilizations have relied upon for 11,000 years." I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before delivering the piece I knew would change everything. "Look closely at the authorship marking in the bottom corner of that document," I said. "I would like the record's official to read it aloud, so there is no confusion about translation." The official leaned toward the console, studying the ancient script carefully, and when they spoke, their voice carried a note of genuine confusion. "The authorship marking reads as a designation unfamiliar to current council records," the official said slowly. "A species classification that does not match any of the 7 founding members." "Because it isn't one of them," I said. "Cross-reference that designation against any historical record of early human colonial expeditions, specifically any record involving long-range exploratory vessels launched from Earth roughly 14,000 years ago, well before your council was ever founded." The chamber erupted into noise, delegates turning to each other in confusion and disbelief, several officials scrambling toward their own data consoles to check whatever record I had just pointed them toward. Vorn Kaith raised a hand, and slowly the noise died down, though the tension in the room had shifted into something entirely new. "That is an extraordinary claim," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier calm certainty. "You are suggesting that a human expedition, predating this council by thousands of years, designed the corridor system that founded our entire interstellar civilization." "I am not suggesting it," I said. "I am showing it to you, directly from your own archive, which you have just watched your own official confirm in front of the entire chamber." I turned slowly, scanning the rows of stunned faces around me, feeling something shift in the air, a crack forming in the certainty that had filled this room only minutes earlier. "And this," I said quietly, "is only the first file." Reith Solon rose from her seat, her earlier composure gone, replaced by something sharper, more defensive. "Even if this record is authentic, one document proves nothing. A single early contribution does not change the fact that humanity remains an unregistered, undefended species with no formal standing before this council." "You're right," I said, meeting her gaze directly. "One document proves very little on its own, so let me show you the next one, and the one after that, and every single one after that, until this chamber understands exactly how much of what you call your own history was quietly written by people you almost sold today without a single question asked." I turned back to the records official. "Display the file marked Charter Origin," I said. "I believe everyone here should see exactly where your founding governance structure actually came from." The chamber went utterly silent, 211 ancient beings watching a young archivist from a species they had just voted to erase, waiting to see exactly what she would reveal next. I took a slow breath, steadying myself for what was about to come. This was only the beginning. The file marked Charter Origin appeared above the platform, and this time, the chamber did not wait for the records official to confirm anything before the whispering started. The document was old, older than the jump corridor file, its formatting so archaic that even the automatic translation system struggled to render it cleanly. But the structure was unmistakable to anyone who had ever studied council law, because the governance framework written on that ancient page was, almost word for word, the same framework the council still used to run itself today. "This document predates the official founding charter by nearly 2,000 years, I said, letting my voice carry clearly across the silence. "It outlines a system of rotating leadership, weighted voting based on population rather than age, and a mandatory review period for any law affecting a newly discovered species. Every single one of those principles exists in your current charter, almost unchanged, right down to the specific numerical thresholds required to pass a motion like the one you passed against humanity today." Groth Ilsa, the broad-armored counselor who had laughed at me earlier, was no longer laughing. He leaned forward in his seat, studying the document with narrowed eyes. This could be coincidence. Governance structures converge naturally when species solve similar problems. That would be a reasonable argument, I said, if this were the only similarity. But I would like the Council to consider something else. The founding charter your Council operates under today was formally adopted 11,000 years ago, correct? The records official checked the console again. Correct. And the document currently displayed above this platform is dated using the same archive calibration system used for the jump corridor file. A calibration system tied directly to early human expedition logs. A murmur spread through the chamber, delegates leaning toward each other, some pulling up their own personal data devices to check the calibration systems themselves. I want to be very clear about what I am not saying, I continued. I am not saying humanity invented every idea your civilizations have ever had. I am not saying you are incapable of your own thought or your own progress. What I am saying is that at critical moments, at the very beginning of major turning points in this galaxy's shared history, human expeditions were present, contributing, and in many cases, quietly credited under designations that were later reclassified, renamed, or simply lost as your official records were updated and modernized over thousands of years. This is absurd, Rithe Solun said, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. If this were true, if human contributions were truly so significant, why would there be no record of it in Common Council history? Why would something this important simply vanish? That, I said, is an excellent question, and I intend to answer it fully. But first, I want to show you one more file, because I believe it will answer part of that question on its own. I turned back to the records official. Display the file marked Silent Accord. The official hesitated this time, glancing toward Vorn Kaith with an expression that suggested even they were uncertain what that particular file contained. Proceed, Vorn Kaith said quietly, his earlier authority replaced by something more careful, almost cautious. The file appeared, and this one was different from the others. It was not a technical schematic or a governance document. It was a formal record of an agreement, signed by representatives from several early species, including a designation that once again did not match any current founding member. It records an agreement between several early galactic species and a human delegation present at that time. In this agreement, human representatives voluntarily requested that their contributions to shared technology, governance, and infrastructure be recorded under joint designations rather than individual human credit. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in before continuing. In simple terms, I said, humanity asked to be quietly written out of your history, not because we were forced to, not because anyone erased us against our will. We asked for it ourselves. The chamber fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence. Why would any species do that? Groth Ilsa asked, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine confusion. Why would you willingly erase your own legacy? I took a slow breath before answering, because this was the part of the story I had spent 3 years trying to understand myself, piecing together fragments from dozens of scattered records, cross-referencing dates and designations until the full picture finally came into focus. Because roughly 10,000 years ago, I said, humanity experienced something in this galaxy that nearly ended us. Not a war between species, not a natural disaster, but something closer to a catastrophic failure of ambition. I gestured toward the records official. Display the file marked Ashfall Logs. The file that appeared was different from the others, darker in tone, the language more fragmented, clearly damaged or partially corrupted over the thousands of years since it had first been recorded. According to these logs, I said, an early human exploratory alliance, having contributed significantly to the early technological foundation of this galaxy, made a critical decision that ultimately led to the near-total collapse of an entire star system under their control. The details are incomplete, but the surviving records describe a project involving experimental energy extraction on a scale far beyond what the technology of the time could safely manage. I let the silence stretch, feeling the discomfort settle over the chamber like a physical weight. The result, I continued, was the loss of that entire system. Not through any external attack, not through any conflict with another species, but through human ambition outpacing human caution. Millions of lives were lost, human and otherwise, in a disaster that could have been avoided if the people responsible had simply waited, tested more carefully, and moved with the patience that hindsight makes so painfully obvious. Vorn Kaith's expression had shifted entirely now, the careful, guarded stillness of someone hearing something they had never expected to hear in this chamber. After that disaster, I said, the surviving human leadership of that era made a decision. They would continue to contribute to the shared progress of this galaxy, because by that point, human ingenuity and human labor were deeply woven into projects across dozens of early species. But they would no longer seek credit, recognition, or individual standing for that work. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that humanity's ambition was dangerous, and that stepping back from visibility, from power, from formal recognition, was the only way to prevent another disaster on that scale." Unquote. That decision, I said, was passed down through generations of quiet agreements, through officials who moved further and further out of the public eye, contributing to shared projects without ever standing on a platform like this one to claim what they had built. Over thousands of years, as species after species rose and changed and rebuilt their own histories, human involvement faded from memory, not because it was erased by force, but because it was voluntarily, deliberately, and carefully hidden by the very people who built it. "And you are telling us this now," Rethay Solun said slowly, "on the day we voted to sell your species, because you believe it will change our minds." "I am telling you this now," I said, "because it is relevant to the vote you have already passed, and because it will become directly relevant to the vote you are about to take in the coming hours to confirm it." I turned to the records official one final time. "I would like to display one more file," I said, "the most recent one in this section, dated roughly 120 standard years ago." The official's fingers moved across the console, and a new document appeared, this one modern in formatting, clearly created much closer to the present day. "This," I said, "is a formal internal assessment conducted by the same quiet human oversight structure that has existed since the Ashfall disaster, evaluating the risk of official first contact with the wider council. It was completed shortly before your survey ships first discovered Earth and formally cataloged humanity as a newly contacted species." I let the document hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. This assessment concluded that continued concealment was no longer sustainable, given humanity's technological growth and the increasing likelihood of accidental discovery. It recommended a gradual, careful reintroduction of humanity into visible galactic society, allowing enough time for trust to be rebuilt before any of the older, deeper contributions were formally revealed. "In other words," Groth Ilsa said slowly, "you have been waiting." "We have been waiting," I confirmed. "For over a century, since your survey ships first found us, we have been patient. We have allowed ourselves to be treated as a young, unproven species, because revealing the truth too quickly, without the proper foundation of trust, seemed more dangerous than staying quiet a little longer." I paused, letting my gaze move slowly across the chamber, resting briefly on each founding species in turn. "But today," I said, "this council did not give us the luxury of more time. Today, this council decided that humanity was nothing more than an unclaimed resource to be sold to the highest bidder, without a single question asked about who we actually are, or what we have actually done for every single species sitting in this room." The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. It was not confusion, and it was not amusement. It was the particular stillness of powerful beings realizing all at once that the ground beneath them was not as solid as they had always believed. Vorn Kaith rose slowly from his seat, his ancient composure visibly shaken for the first time since I had entered this chamber. "Representative Marsh," he said carefully, "you are making an extraordinary claim, one that, if verified fully, would fundamentally alter this council's understanding of its own foundation. I must ask directly, Are you prepared to provide complete verification of everything you have shown us today, under full council scrutiny, with no room for error or exaggeration? I met his gaze without flinching, feeling something settle inside me, a quiet certainty that had been building since the moment I first opened those forgotten archive files 3 years ago. I am, I said, and I believe, once you understand the full scope of what your civilizations actually stand on, you will find that the question is no longer whether humanity deserves a seat in this chamber. I paused, letting the moment stretch just long enough for every delegate to lean forward, waiting. The real question, I said, is whether this council can survive knowing exactly how much of itself was quietly given to it by the very species it just tried to sell. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber spoke. 211 delegates sat frozen, caught somewhere between disbelief and the slow, uncomfortable realization that the evidence hanging above the platform had come directly from their own archive, verified by their own official, in front of everyone. Vorn Kaith remained standing, his hands resting on the edge of his seat, his ancient eyes fixed on me with an expression I could not fully read. Finally he spoke. "You said this council does not fully understand what it stands on," he said slowly. "I would ask you to explain that more clearly, Representative Marsh. What exactly are you claiming humanity has given us, beyond the documents you have already shown?" I turned slowly, taking in the full weight of the chamber around me, every species, every delegation, every ancient and powerful being waiting for my answer. "I am not simply claiming that humans contributed to a few early technologies," I said. "I am telling you that the very tools this council uses to communicate, to travel, to govern itself, all trace back, in part, to human labor and human ingenuity offered freely, without credit, over thousands of years. The translation protocol every delegate in this room relies on right now was built from a linguistic framework, first developed by a joint research effort in which human contributors made up the majority of the working team. The framework for jump corridor safety regulations, the very rules that keep every ship in this galaxy from suffering the same disaster that once nearly destroyed us, were written in direct response to what we learned from our own mistake. I let that settle before continuing. Your medical treaties, the ones that allow different species to share healing technology across borders without fear of biological conflict, were built on a compatibility framework developed by human researchers working quietly within a joint medical alliance almost 8,000 years ago. Even your calendar system, the standardized way this entire council measures time across 100 different worlds, was adapted from an early human solar measurement system, modified slightly to account for the orbital patterns of the founding worlds. Growth Ilsa shook his head slowly, his earlier hostility replaced by something quieter, almost overwhelmed. "You are saying there is no part of this council's foundation that remains untouched by your species." "I am saying," I replied gently, "that we built quietly, carefully, and without asking for anything in return, because we believed that was the safest way to contribute after what our own ambition had once cost us. We did not do this to gain leverage over you. We did not do this expecting that one day we would stand in this chamber and use it as proof against a vote to sell us. We did it because it was the right thing to do, and because staying hidden felt safer than standing tall." I paused, feeling something tighten in my chest, a mixture of exhaustion and something close to grief for all the generations of humans who had quietly given everything they had to a galaxy that had never known their names. "But today," I said, my voice steady, despite the emotion beneath it, "this council looked at my species, saw an unregistered world with no formal defense treaty, and decided we were nothing more than an asset to be auctioned off. You did not ask who we were. You did not ask what we had done. You simply assumed that because we had chosen to remain quiet, we must also be small." I let my gaze sweep across the chamber one final time before delivering the words that would become the center of everything that followed. I smiled. It was not a smile of triumph, and it was not a smile of anger. It was tired, and it was patient, the kind of smile you offer when you have carried a heavy truth for a very long time and are finally allowed to set it down. "We built your entire civilization," I said quietly, my voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "Not through conquest, not through control, through quiet, patient work, generation after generation, asking for nothing in return except the chance to live peacefully among you one day, without fear of being erased the moment someone decided we were inconvenient." Nobody spoke, nobody moved. 211 ancient beings sat in complete silence, staring at a young human archivist who had just calmly dismantled every assumption their civilization had ever made about itself. Retha Solon was the first to break the silence, though her voice had lost every trace of its earlier confidence. "If this is true, why reveal it now? Why not simply let the vote pass, and let humanity quietly disappear as you claim your ancestors intended?" I turned to her, and for the first time since stepping onto that platform, I allowed a flicker of real emotion to show through. Because there is a difference between choosing to stay quiet and being sold without a single question asked, I said. "My ancestors chose humility. They did not choose erasure. There is a difference between a species stepping back out of caution and a species being auctioned off because nobody bothered to check what they were actually worth." I looked toward Vorn Kaith directly. "You asked me earlier what humanity has given this council," I said. "I have shown you technology, governance, medicine, even the calendar you use to measure your own history. But I want to be clear about something else, something far more important than any single invention or protocol." I paused, letting the silence stretch, feeling every eye in the chamber fixed on me. "If this vote is confirmed today," I said, "if humanity is formally sold and reallocated as an asset, every single system built on human contribution becomes legally entangled in that transaction. Every jump corridor safety protocol, every shared medical treaty, every piece of governance framework quietly written by human hands over thousands of years, all of it exists because of agreements made by human representatives who no longer have any standing to maintain them, once humanity itself is stripped of any recognized status." A ripple of alarm spread through the chamber, delegates turning to each other, murmuring urgently now, some already reaching for their own data devices. "In simple terms," I said, "you are not simply voting to sell an unclaimed world. You are voting to destabilize the very foundation this council has quietly relied upon for thousands of years, without ever realizing how deeply that foundation depended on the species you were about to erase." Vorn Kaith's expression had shifted entirely now, the ancient calm replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. "If what you are saying is true," he said slowly, "then this vote cannot simply be allowed to proceed as planned. The council would need immediate, full verification of every claim you have made, across every archive available, before any confirmation could reasonably move forward." "That is exactly what I am asking for," I said. "Not mercy, not pity, simply the chance for this council to fully understand what it is about to do, before it does it." For a long moment, Vorn Kaith said nothing, his gaze moving slowly across the chamber, taking in the stunned faces of delegates who had, only minutes earlier, been ready to vote away an entire species without a second thought. Finally, he turned back to me, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. "Representative Marsh," he said, "you have given this council a great deal to consider. I do not believe any confirmation vote can proceed today, not until every claim you have presented has been fully and independently verified." He paused, glancing briefly toward the still glowing tally hanging above the platform, the number that had once seemed so final, now suddenly uncertain. "This session is suspended," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "The council will reconvene once full verification has been completed. Representative Marsh, you will remain available to this council throughout that process." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me, exhaustion and relief mixing together in a way I had never experienced before. "I will," I said quietly. As the chamber began to stir, delegates rising from their seats, urgent conversations breaking out across every section, I allowed myself one final look around the room, at the ancient, powerful beings who had, only an hour earlier, been ready to sell my species without a second thought. They were not ready to sell us anymore. But I knew, standing there in the center of that vast chamber, that this was only the beginning of a much longer conversation, one that would determine not just humanity's fate, but the future of every species who now had to reckon with exactly how much they had never known about the quiet hands that had shaped their entire world. 3 days passed before the council reconvened, and in that time, the chamber I had once stood in alone became the center of a verification effort unlike anything the council had conducted in centuries. I spent almost every waking hour in a small, windowless records room deep beneath the main chamber, sitting across from a rotating panel of archivists and historians from a dozen different species, all of them cross-checking every file I had presented, alongside hundreds more I had not yet shown the full council. Daniel Cross stayed by my side through most of it, quietly supporting me through the exhaustion, though I could tell even he was struggling to process the full scope of what we had uncovered together. On the second day, a young historian from a small aquatic species named Isla Ket sat across from me, her expression caught somewhere between wonder and disbelief as she reviewed a stack of ancient medical treaty documents. "I have studied the founding era for most of my professional life," she said quietly, sliding one document toward me. "I always believed our compatibility framework was developed entirely by the founding species working together. I never once considered that a discovered species might have played a central role in creating it." "Most people never had a reason to consider it," I said. "That was the point. We built quietly enough that nobody ever thought to ask." She studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "Why are you telling us all of this now, so completely, without holding anything back for negotiation? You could have used this information more carefully, revealed it piece by piece, gained far more advantage over time." I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, because it was one I had asked myself many times over the past 3 days. "Because hiding got us into this position in the first place," I said finally. "My ancestors chose quiet humility because they believed it was the safest path after a mistake nearly destroyed us. But quiet humility also meant nobody ever really knew who we were, and that made it far too easy for this council to look at an unregistered species and assume we were worth nothing more than the ground beneath our feet. I would rather stand in the light and be fully known, mistakes and contributions both, than stay hidden and be sold by people who never bothered to ask." Isla Ket nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had met her, she smiled. "That is a braver answer than most representatives would give." By the 4th day, verification was complete. Every file I had presented, along with hundreds of supporting documents I had provided during the review process, had been confirmed as authentic by an independent council panel with no prior connection to the human delegation. The full scope of humanity's quiet contribution to galactic civilization, spanning technology, governance, medicine, and infrastructure, was no longer a claim. It was fact. When the council reconvened for the final session, the chamber felt entirely different from the room I had first walked into days earlier. The casual, dismissive murmurs were gone, replaced by a tense, careful silence as delegates took their seats, many of them glancing toward the human section of the gallery with expressions I had never seen directed at us before. Ambassador Reese Calloway, humanity's official representative, had finally arrived 2 days earlier, his transport fault repaired just in time to witness the final verification results alongside me. He stood beside me now on the central platform, tall and composed, though I could see the same exhaustion in his eyes that I felt in my own bones. Vorn Kaith rose from his seat, and the chamber fell into complete silence. "4 days ago," he said, his voice carrying the same deep authority as before, though now tempered with something closer to humility, "this council voted to proceed with the reallocation of an entire species, based on the assumption that they were an unregistered, undefended, and ultimately insignificant presence in this galaxy." He paused, his gaze moving slowly across the chamber. "That assumption has been proven not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong," he continued. "Independent verification has confirmed every claim presented by Representative Marsh during her final address. Humanity's quiet contributions span the very foundation of this council's technology, governance, and shared infrastructure, extending back thousands of years before most species in this chamber ever achieved interstellar travel. A murmur spread through the chamber, though this time it carried no trace of the earlier dismissiveness. In light of this verification, Vornkaith continued, the Council cannot in good conscience proceed with the confirmation vote as originally scheduled. To do so would not only be a grave injustice to a species that has quietly shaped this galaxy for millennia, it would also risk catastrophic instability across every system currently relying on frameworks humanity helped create. I move instead, he said, that this council formally recognize humanity, not as a newly discovered species subject to open reallocation, but as a founding contributor to galactic civilization, deserving of full recognition, defense standing, and a permanent seat within this chamber. The chamber erupted into discussion, delegates turning to each other, some nodding slowly, others still visibly working through the shock of everything they had learned over the past 4 days. Vornkaith allowed the moment to settle before calling for order. All those in favor of formal recognition, he said, cast your vote now. The voting screens above each delegation lit up once more, and this time I watched the lights change from red to green, one section at a time, until the entire chamber glowed with unanimous agreement. Even Rethe Solon and Groth Ilsa, the 2 delegates who had spoken most sharply against humanity days earlier, cast their votes in favor without hesitation. The final tally appeared above the platform. 214 votes in favor, 0 opposed. The motion passes, Vornkaith announced. Humanity is hereby formally recognized as a founding contributor to galactic civilization, granted full defense standing, and offered a permanent seat within this council, effective immediately. Ambassador Calloway stepped forward to accept the formal recognition on behalf of humanity, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly building beneath the surface. But before the ceremony concluded, Vornkaith turned to me directly. Representative Marsh, he said, it is customary for the individual whose testimony leads to a decision of this magnitude to be offered a formal position within this council, should they choose to accept it. I would like to extend that offer to you now, not as a junior archivist, but as a founding representative of your species, with full standing to speak in this chamber whenever you see fit. I looked out at the sea of faces surrounding me, the same delegates who had voted to sell my species only 4 days earlier, now watching me with something between respect and quiet awe. I accept, I said simply. As the session began to close, delegates rising from their seats, quiet conversations breaking out across the chamber, Daniel found his way to my side, a tired but genuine smile on his face. You did it, he said quietly. You actually did it. We did it, I corrected gently. Every human who came before us, every generation who chose to build quietly, instead of demanding recognition, they did the real work. I just happened to be the one standing here when it finally mattered. He nodded, then hesitated, his expression shifting slightly. Elena, how much of what you showed the council came from that archive section? The full extent of it, I mean. You mentioned there was more than what you presented. I felt a small, knowing smile cross my face, one I did not bother to hide. There is more, I admitted, far more than I revealed in that chamber, enough to keep historians across a dozen species busy for the next several decades, if I'm being honest. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How much more? I looked back toward the now emptying chamber, at the ancient beings filing out through the great doors, still visibly shaken by everything they had learned over the past 4 days, unaware that what I had shown them was only a small fraction of a much longer, much deeper history. Let's just say, I said quietly, today was only the first conversation. There are still a few things this galaxy does not know about who we really are and what else we quietly helped build, long before any of them ever learned our name. As I turned to leave the chamber, stepping out into the wide corridor beyond, I found myself thinking not of the vote that had almost erased my species, nor of the recognition we had just won, but of every quiet hand throughout human history who had built something remarkable and asked for nothing in return. For thousands of years, we had chosen to stay hidden, believing that humility was safer than recognition. But standing there, in the aftermath of everything that had just happened, I understood something my ancestors perhaps never fully realized. Sometimes, the quietest contributions carry the loudest truth, waiting patiently for the right moment to finally be heard. And for humanity, that moment had only just begun.